Before we get started with today's podcast episode, I just want to take a minute to tell you about a free masterclass for dance teachers I have coming up soon. Training Turnout in Dancers is happening Sunday, May 4th at 10 a.m. Pacific. Turnout is one of the hallmark features of classical ballet and many other forms of dance, and dancers have long strived to achieve the elusive 180 degrees of quote-unquote perfect turnout. Although we know 180 degrees is often unrealistic, many dancers still strive to improve their turnout as much as possible. In this masterclass, you'll learn all about the anatomy of turnout, what the most common causes of limitations in turnout are, and how to address these limitations to help your dancers achieve their maximum turnout safely. I would love to have you join me on Sunday, May 4th. For more information and to save your free spot in the masterclass, go to www.allegro-performance.com/training-turnout. And now, here's today's episode. Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Today, we are going to get into a topic that has come up a couple of times. People have requested it, sending in DMs or emails to me and requesting this topic. So I thought that this was the perfect time to dive into it, and also a great time to remind you that if you do ever have any requests for podcast topics or episodes, please feel free to send them to me. I cannot guarantee that I will record and publish them immediately, but I do keep a running list, and so anytime I'm looking for an idea of what I am going to discuss on the podcast, I always go back to that list. So please, anytime anything pops into your head, feel free, send me a request. So, like I said, today's podcast topic has been sent in by a few different people. So it wasn't just one person's request. It's come in a few different times recently. So I thought that we would tackle it. And this is the topic of gripping in the hip. This is something that oftentimes it's actually teachers who reach out to me and say, how do we deal with the kids that are either gripping in the hip or gripping in the front of the thigh, sort of in that quadriceps area? How do we decrease that? Why is it happening? What do we do to address it? And then sometimes it has been dancers who've reached out who say, every time I develope my leg devant, I get this gripping feeling or this tightness in the front of my hip. What is causing it? What do I do about it? So it can definitely be teachers who are observing it in dancers, but just as likely, dancers will often experience it or that sensation themselves. When we are talking about gripping in the front of the hip, we are often talking about, like I said, that gripping sensation or overuse in the front of the thigh. But we may also be talking about more of kind of like a jamming sensation in the front of the hip itself. So some dancers will experience it feeling like right in the front of the hip, kind of in like the crease area in the front of the hip, and other dancers might experience it a little bit more into the top of the thigh. Generally, dancers are going to report this feeling of gripping with extensions going to the front, so anything devant, as well as things going to à la seconde. So that is usually things like développés, but it can be kicks, it can be other types of extensions going to primarily the front and the side. Because of the mechanics of the hip and the muscles involved that we're going to get into in a minute, we don't see this as commonly when people are doing movements in other planes of movement or in other positions. It is most frequently to the front or to the side. So, in order to understand a little bit about what might be causing that gripping to happen, we need to understand a little bit about the anatomy of the hip itself, but also kind of some of the surrounding musculature and kind of body parts that are closely linked to the hip. Because I think when dancers can understand the anatomy and what is actually going on from an anatomical perspective, it often really, really helps to address this issue. So when we look at specifically the musculature to start with around the hip, we have a bunch of different muscles that have the ability to flex our hip or to bring our leg up into an extension. And like I just said, this gripping or this overuse sensation usually happens when we are bringing our leg to the front or to the side. The group of muscles that are responsible for this movement are what we will often just term our hip flexors. But some people, I think, are under the impression, you hear a lot about hip flexors in just, the world, in the fitness world, in the medical world, in the social media world. People are like really, really fixated on hip flexors a lot of the time. And I think sometimes there is a misconception that like a hip flexor is just one muscle, but it is actually a group of muscles. And then we just use that term hip flexors fairly loosely to talk about this whole group. We have two sort of what we often call deep hip flexors. So these are muscles that originate, or like their origin of the muscle is very, very deep to the hip. So psoas is one of them, and a lot of people have heard of the psoas muscle. Again, it gets talked about a lot in fitness realms and in medical realms. So that is one of the deepest, or is the deepest hip flexor muscle. And then we also have iliacus, and those two muscles actually sort of like form together a little bit. So they start really deep. I'll talk a little bit more about their origin in a second. And then the tendons of those muscles kind of like blend together, for lack of a better description, and attach in a common location on the front of the thigh. So the psoas muscle itself actually originates from the anterior part of your spine. So it's the front part of your spine. And people are often blown away by this because we think of it as a hip flexor muscle, and it is a hip flexor muscle. So when we are picturing it in our head or visualizing it, we are often thinking of it just being right at the very front of our hip, maybe like where the crease at the front of our hip is. But the origin of that muscle, it actually dives kind of through our whole like abdominal or pelvic cavity. It's not quite abdominal, it's more the pelvic cavity, because it originates on the front part of our spine. That means that the psoas muscle actually has a role in stabilizing our spine. And I'm going to come back and talk about that in a second. So that psoas muscle is starting on our spine and then diving through that sort of like hip pelvic cavity and then attaching to the front of the leg. And then that iliacus muscle kind of covers the whole inside part. It's called your iliac crest, but it's the whole ilium or the iliac surface of the inside of the hip. So again, this is like deep inside your hip. That's where that muscle is originating from, and then joining and attaching to the front of the hip. So those are our deep hip flexor muscles. Then we have more superficial hip flexor muscles. And so our rectus femoris, which is actually one of our quadricep muscles, it is one of our more superficial. And what I mean by superficial is closer to the surface of the skin. So these ones don't start like back by your spine. These ones start much closer to the surface of the front of the hip. So we have our rectus femoris, we have our TFL or tensor fascia lata. And then we also have some other ones that in certain positions can act as hip flexors. So sartorius is one. And this is maybe one that we actually do see more in dancers than in other populations, because if we're doing a move, say like an attitude devant, our sartorius might actually be working as quite a bit of a hip flexor in that position, whereas in other positions it doesn't work as a hip flexor quite as much. And then similarly, our pectineus muscle, which is actually one of our inner thigh muscles, it can work as a hip flexor in certain positions as well. And again, because we work in lateral rotation, we may see this be implicated a little bit more in a dance population than in a sort of, quote unquote, general population. So again, you don't need to know the specific names of these necessarily, but the idea of understanding that we have a deeper group of hip flexor muscles and a more superficial or closer to the surface group is important because when we are thinking about gripping in the front of the hip and specifically gripping in that sort of front of the thigh area, what is often happening is dancers are overusing those superficial muscles and specifically that rec fem a lot of the time, and potentially not utilizing their deep hip flexor muscles as much in through there. And that can cause this feeling of gripping or jamming or discomfort in the front of the hip. So that's a little bit about the musculature of the hip. The other thing that's also really important, I think, for dancers to understand is a bit about the mechanics of how the hip joint works. And this is going to be potentially a little bit challenging to explain over an auditory medium like a podcast. This is the type of thing where I sometimes wish that I did my podcast in video form, because if I had, my bone models or could use my hands, it is a little bit easier to explain. So I am going to do my best, but if you're confused by this, I will try and put some links maybe to some YouTube videos or something in the show notes so that you can see kind of what I'm talking about when I talk about the mechanics. This is also a good time. Sorry, this is like a total just interjection here for a second. I have been considering the idea of maybe having a video option for the podcast. So having it recorded and uploaded to something like YouTube as well as the audio sort of medium. I know that this is the future of podcasting, if you will, or people are really going towards that. I haven't yet to this point because to me, podcasts are just meant to be auditory. I would never, ever, ever, ever watch a podcast. I only ever listen to them. I listen to them when I'm out on walks or when I'm commuting or things like that. So to me, I'm like, who is watching these? But a lot of people are, from what I read in the statistics and things like that. So all of that to say, if you have strong feelings one way or another, whether you would watch a video version of this podcast or whether you prefer it to be an audio medium, let me know. I'm curious if people would actually watch it in video format. Anyway, sorry, back on track. Talking about the mechanics of the hip joint. So most people understand that the hip joint is a ball and socket joint. And so we have a sort of round socket. And in the case of the hip, the socket is quite deep. We can think of it as being sort of like, at least half of the shape of, let's say like a tennis ball or something. If you cut it in half, we have like a hip socket that is fairly deep. And then we have the ball part, which is the head of the femur, and that fits into that socket. And it fits in fairly deeply and has good congruency in that joint. When we are extending our leg, and specifically when we are extending our legs above 90 or trying to extend our legs above 90, there are certain mechanics that happen in that hip socket in terms of how that ball and socket joint moves as the leg is rising. And I think a lot of people assume that if our leg is rising up off of the floor. So let's just imagine we have our foot extended to the front like a tendu devant, and we're lifting our leg from there. So we're coming up to, 90 degrees, just lifting the leg. I think a lot of people assume that the ball and socket part of the hip joint just kind of like stays stationary, or there has to be some amount of movement that's happening, but I'm not sure that a lot of people even visualize or understand what that movement is. But what is actually happening at the hip joint is as we have a movement where the leg is extending, and especially, like I said, when it's extending above 90, is the ball part of the ball and socket joint actually rotates posteriorly and inferiorly. So as we're coming devant, so if our leg is in front of us, there's a little bit more of like a posterior glide that is happening, but then it does start to go inferior, so down towards the ground as the leg lifts up. If we have our leg to second or to the side, the glide is mostly inferior because in most dance forms, we're already going to be rotated into external rotation. So the glide that's happening is actually happening down towards the ground. So it's this idea of like the hip socket almost being like a fulcrum in a lever, but it actually kind of has this small amount, it's not a huge amount, but a small amount of inferior movement that happens. And when we can get that inferior glide happening, or when dancers can understand that inferior glide happening, we start to get a little bit less of that kind of gripping or pinching in the front of the hip joint. I'm going to talk in a minute about sort of like cuing or things we can do to address the gripping. And so this concept of understanding a little bit of this ball and socket anatomy is important, just from the perspective of one of the cues that I use when we're addressing this has to do with that understanding of the mechanics of it. So, like I said, it's a little bit tricky to describe without being able to give you a visual, like using my hands or using the bones to show you exactly what happens. But understanding that there is movement that is happening at the hip socket that is going to influence how those muscles are moving and vice versa is important when we're looking at, okay, how is it that we are going to address this kind of overuse or gripping in the front of the thigh? So, that gives you a little bit of a background of the anatomy and the sort of mechanics of the joint. That still doesn't necessarily tell us exactly why some dancers struggle with this gripping and other dancers maybe don't so much. And so one of the things that we see, and probably the biggest cause of this that we see, is an imbalance of how muscles are being recruited and being utilized in this region. And I think I've talked about this on the podcast before, how muscles have sort of what we often call primary jobs, and then they also have other things that they can do that are more secondary jobs. And if a muscle is really busy doing either its primary or its secondary job, and then we ask them to do something else on top of that, oftentimes it gets a little bit overworked, and one of its responses is often to tighten up. And this is what we very commonly see in this kind of like hip flexor situation here. And probably the most common presentation of that I see in the clinic is that psoas muscle, because, like I said, it can stabilize our spine because of where it attaches to the lumbar spine, into the lumbar vertebrae. It has the ability to stabilize the spine. And it actually spends quite a long time doing that in, I will say, like, sort of general population people. It probably has a fairly large role in stabilizing the spine. But if we're asking it to be doing huge amounts of spinal stabilization, and then we're also asking our leg to extend above 90 degrees, either to the front or to the side, that hip flexor is often not able to do all of that work. It's like it gets overloaded. And so one of the more superficial hip flexor muscles, oftentimes the rectus femoris, will end up kind of taking over, end up overworking to make up for the fact that the hip flexor is maybe not able to as effectively flex the hip. So one of the first things that we need to look at to address this type of issue is actually to look at how well a dancer is able to control their lumbar spine. How well can they stabilize in various positions? Because we have lots of other muscles that are meant to be primary spinal stabilizers. So we have small ones that are really deep, like our multifidus and our rotatories and all of these little muscles that are like at a segmental level at the spine that work as deep spinal stabilizers. And we also have bigger, more superficial back muscles like our erector spinae muscle and muscles like that also have a role in controlling or stabilizing our spinal movement. But if those muscles are not working as effectively as we want them to be, then what we will often see is that psoas muscle kind of overworking and therefore maybe not able to as efficiently help with hip flexion movements. Similarly, so in kind of like a similar vein, what we often see is dancers who maybe are also not stabilizing super efficiently through their core muscles and specifically their deep core muscles. So whether that is their transversus or sometimes it might be more their oblique muscles or even their rectus abdominis. So it could be any of those core muscles or those abdominal muscles. Like I said, most often it is the deeper sort of transversus ones. If dancers are not stabilizing well through that area, again, they may end up compensating with some of these hip flexor muscles, which in turn, again, overworks those muscles, causes them to sort of become overly tight or grippy or whatever terminology you want to use for that. So we need to look a lot at how well a dancer can control their trunk and their pelvis, not mobility, but how well they can control their trunk and their pelvis in relation to their hip movements in order to understand how efficiently the muscles are potentially working. And one thing that we, again, see commonly in dancers, and I see this really commonly, especially in young dancers, is young dancers often struggle to stabilize their pelvis well and move their hip independently of the pelvis. So they often end up using those muscles to kind of do a bunch of those jobs all at once, which means that they're not doing any of those jobs really, really efficiently. So making sure that we can train them to do that independently of each other is one of the keys to addressing some of this gripping, which I will get into in a second. So those are the most common reasons why we see that sort of overuse or the gripping happening in the quadricep muscle. I think I feel like I can't do a podcast episode on this topic without kind of interjecting or putting this like little point in here. But in the past, I think you often heard cuing or heard dance teachers use phrases like, make sure you're not using your quad when you're extending your leg, or even things like make sure you're lifting your leg from underneath or things like that. And I would hope that we've moved away from that a little bit now, with everybody having a much better understanding of anatomy than maybe we did. For instance, back when I was dancing, I know it was certainly something my teachers would talk about, not so much the lifting the leg from underneath, but definitely the don't use your quad muscle. It was something that our teachers harped on a lot. Don't use your quad muscle when you're lifting your leg. Make sure you're not using your quad. And as a dancer, and especially a dancer who was maybe a little bit interested in the body and in anatomy, I did not understand that cue at all. And now it makes perfect sense why I didn't understand it, because you can't actually lift your leg without those muscles being involved. And especially if we are thinking of extensions to the front or even to the side, I'm just going to take rectus femoris muscle. Its job is hip flexion and knee extension. And that is essentially exactly what we are doing in those positions if we're doing any sort of a développé or a kick or anything. So we absolutely need to use those muscles. We just want to make sure that we have the balance of that activation correct, so that we're not just overly gripping with the superficial hip flexor muscles. So I just wanted to clear that up because, like I said, I think hopefully we're not hearing that terminology anymore. But if any, especially dancers, are listening to this and are wondering, okay, wait a second, how do some of those cues fit in? We absolutely 100% need to be using our hip flexors and our quad muscles to achieve these movements. So for anybody telling a dancer to not use those, that is just incorrect. But we need to be able to do it in efficient ways where we're not overly gripping through those muscles and causing those sensations of tightness or jamming or discomfort in the front of the hip. So how do we go about addressing this issue? Like I alluded to before, for me, one of the most effective ways of addressing this isn't actually giving dancers loads of fancy exercises to do and totally retraining all their movement patterns or anything like that. But I always start with really explaining the anatomy of this area, and specifically the hip joint, to dancers. Because if dancers understand the anatomy of the muscles around the area and what their primary jobs are and what their secondary jobs are, and more importantly, understand the mechanics of the hip joint and how it works, this often really, really helps to address the issue without even going into any sort of movement pattern retraining or strengthening or anything like that. Again, in some cases, we absolutely need to go there, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But in a lot of cases, just explaining the mechanics really helps dancers to understand this. So I use a lot of cuing, and for looking at, I keep using the example of a développé, but it's an easy one for people to kind of visualize, and it's often one of the movements that people find the most gripping because it can be slow sometimes. So if we use that sort of movement and think about the cuing, I think sometimes in dance, we really focus on the the farther end of the lever. So in this case, our foot. And we'll really cue what is happening to the foot as we're doing this. And so if we're coming up into our retire or our passe, then we're extending, let's say, to the side, we'll just think about, okay, get your foot higher, lift the foot. And it's all of this emphasis on the like furthest end of the lever. And this oftentimes, in my experience, results in some overactivation or some gripping in through the front of that thigh. If we instead think about what is happening at the hip socket or the hip joint itself and really think about keeping that hip, I sometimes use cuing such as like sucking it in or really like centering it in the hip socket and really feeling that inferior glide. So as your leg is lifting, you can lift your knee up. So again, if we're in that passe or retire position, before you start your extension or as you start your extension, think about lifting your knee slightly higher, but at the same time, your hip joint is going to be gliding down towards the floor. So your hip is sinking into the socket, and then you can unfold your leg from there. And it is much, much easier to get your leg higher or get your leg above 90 when we have that correct biomechanics happening at the hip socket itself. So I use a lot of cueing and visualization. Then in the clinic, I have bone models and I can show dancers what is actually happening. But just understanding the mechanics of the joint oftentimes really helps to address some of this gripping issue. Then we do, in some cases, need to actually address if there is some sort of a motor control issue going on or a strength issue or things like that. And so this is when I'll really start to look at how well can a dancer stabilize and control through their trunk and through their pelvis and then move the hip independently of that. And there are a couple of positions that I really like using to assess this. One of them is on hands and knees. So just in like a 4-point kneeling or a quadruped or whatever you want to call that position. So a lot of dancers, just that position itself, they're going to struggle to get into a position where they can actually get their hip joint at a proper 90-degree angle. What you'll see is almost all dancers will have their weight too far forward, so their hip joint will be like relatively opened, if that makes sense, like a little bit more extended. It won't be at a 90-degree right angle. It would be at a more oblique angle, like 110 degrees or something like that. So they're going to have more weight over their hands and not be quite at 90 degrees at the hip. If you ask them to shift their weight backwards a little bit, so their hips lined up directly over their toes, or over their, their hips lined up over their knees, what you will often see is they'll go into a little bit of a posterior pelvic tilt. So they're always going to have that sort of feeling of tucking their tail or a little bit of like that tailbone tucked down or that posterior tilt. Most dancers, when you like try and correct that and really get them to sort of hinge from the hips or crease at the front of the hip and get into a true 90-degree angle, they're really going to feel like they're sticking their tailbone up in the air. But that in itself, just being able to find that 4-point position is really telling in terms of what strategy they're using to stabilize through their lumbar spine. And it might give us an idea that if they're struggling to like dissociate or to move their pelvis independently of their hip in that position, that maybe they're using that psoas muscle to try and stabilize their lumbar spine. So I use that position a lot to assess their ability to control it, to be stable in that position, and then their ability to move their hip. And I know a lot of people use a lot of hip extension from that position. I'm sure you're familiar with like Superman type exercises. So extending one leg out behind you or like one leg and opposite arm. And you can certainly look at those types of movements and see what's happening in terms of control through the lumbar spine or through the pelvis. But what I will use, and especially if we are dealing with kind of gripping in the hip, is I will actually use hip flexion from that position. And so you're bringing your knee up into more hip flexion. So when you're on your hands and knees, your hips already flexed to 90 degrees. degrees. But what happens if we try and slide that knee even further forward and come up into 120 degrees of hip flexion or somewhere in that neighborhood? And a lot of dancers are really going to struggle to be able to maintain a neutral pelvis position as they bring their hip or bring their knee up, so into more hip flexion. What you will see almost immediately is, again, you'll get their tail tucking down. They'll get that sort of posterior pelvic tilt going on. We can play with that on various angles. So I'll start by coming straight forward into hip flexion, but then coming into, maybe it's more towards our armpit. So a little bit more like, I don't know, let's say 30 degrees abduction or whatever that ends up being. So you can play around and see if there's certain angles or certain areas where maybe they might be struggling a little bit more with control. So 4-point is one of the areas that I will look at. A glute bridge, so a hip bridge, like lying on our back, hip bridge, and then trying to march one leg up. So again, coming into hip flexion to see what happens to everything else when that happens. So as we lift one foot off the ground, are we seeing the pelvis rotate? Are we seeing the pelvis drop? Are we seeing people arch through their low back? Are we seeing them round through their low back? What is it we see as we come up into that glute bridge position, but then try and isolate one leg coming up into hip flexion? So that's another position that I will look at a lot, just to give information about, okay, what is it we need to focus on in terms of either pelvic control or spinal control or dissociation between the hip and the pelvis or any of those things. And then finally, another position I like looking at is a side lying position. And this one's especially nice if they are struggling with extension to the side, so à la seconde. This position is nice because we can look at, okay, what is happening from the mechanics. We can really work on that joint glide, that inferior glide of the hip, kind of how the hip is rolling in the socket as we're moving if we're coming up into a rotary or something lying on our side. But we can also look again at how well somebody is stabilizing through their pelvis, through their trunk, through their core, and all of those things. So depending on the dancer in front of you, I might look at all of those positions, or I might only look at one or two of those positions, but those are definitely positions that I will often look at to get good information about how it is that they are stabilizing and approaching those movement patterns. Once we have looked at that in terms of making sure that they are using efficient movement patterns to stabilize in through the pelvis and the trunk and using their deep core muscles and using those deep spinal stabilizers and all of those types of things, we sometimes need to look at the strength of the hip flexor muscles. And I know I've talked about this before on the podcast, but oftentimes one of the biggest reasons why a muscle will tighten up is if it is not strong enough to be doing what we are asking it to do. But our bodies are fairly smart and often very obliging in terms of trying to do what it is we are asking them to do. And so they will find any means possible to do that. And one of the things that muscles will often do is just like really, really tighten up as a way of trying to provide control or trying to provide stability or sort of pseudo strength, as I like to call it. So if we've looked at stabilization through the pelvis and the trunk and all of that seems to be under control and being, managed appropriately, let's say, then we sometimes do need to look at pure strength of those hip flexor muscles and really looking at strength of, especially that psoas muscle at end range. There is not a lot that we do from a strengthening perspective in sort of quote unquote more traditional strength training programs that really look at strength of the hip flexor group at a more end range movement. So I'm talking like the hip flex to 90 degrees or above 90 degrees. So when we're looking at developing strength training programs for dancers, this is something we need to address because as much as I love a good squat and a deadlift and all of those types of movement patterns and think that dancers should absolutely be doing those, we often also need to be strengthening hip flexors in end range. So if that's not something we're already addressing, and like I said, everything else from a motor control and stability perspective in other areas has been addressed, then that is probably a piece of the puzzle that needs to be added in so that dancers have enough strength in that muscle group to be able to sustain those extensions at end range. And we know that dancers often have sort of a discrepancy between their passive range, like how high they can get their leg versus where they can hold it. And so if you picture a dancer, sort of doing like like shouldering their leg, like, when you use your arm to bring your leg up by your ear, say in second or whatever position, and then you let go of it and you sort of see how far it drops before you can kind of quote unquote catch it. That's the difference between our active and our passive mobility. And so passive mobility being how high we can get our leg if we're pushing it or using some sort of an assist, versus active, which is like how much strength do we have to be able to hold it there. And that is definitely one of the things that dancers are often lacking, is strength at end of range in those hip flexor muscle groups. So that is the last thing I'm going to say about that. But like I said, if other areas are already being addressed, and even if a dancer is already doing a strength training program, there is a good chance, especially if it's not a dancer-specific strength training program, there is a good chance it could be lacking some end range hip flexor strength. So definitely something we want to just make sure that we are addressing in through there. All right. I'm going to wrap that up. I hope that was helpful to you in terms of understanding a little bit more about why we see gripping in the front of the hip or in the front of the thigh happen in dancers, and also a little bit about how we can help address it either through cueing and or through addressing those movement patterns that we see in dancers that might be contributing to that gripping problem. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything, please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me on all of the social media channels at Dance Physio Erika with a K, or send me an email. My email address is in the show notes. Once again, thank you so much for listening today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.